Welcome to the Achieve Results Now podcast, the podcast that gives you immediate actions you can take to start seeing life-shifting results now. Hey everybody, welcome to the Achieve Results Now podcast. This is Mark Cardone.
And Theron Feidt.
I'm going to ask a broad sweeping question today, but to our listeners, have you ever made a mistake? You know, it's funny how, we talk about success a lot, right? Like we talk about achieving goals, doing things, but I feel like one of the most important parts of that process is the mistakes we make, right? Because if we don't ever make mistakes, we never grow. So
right, for sure. Yeah, and I think mistakes can come about in a few different ways, and I'm just going to name a few. I'm sure there's other ways. I think mistakes can happen when we're just an autopilot, so habitual, right? And we don't even realize it until after we did the mistake, after we reacted wrongly to somebody. I think that's very common. We could be in our head too much. We've been just daydreaming or whatever, and I think that's common to do. And you can like forgive somebody for that unless it happens all the time, and they're not doing anything different about it.
right.
I think some mistakes, self-sabotage, which we've done a podcast on self-sabotage. You don't see yourself, and the basis of that is you don't see yourself to where you're going, the growth that you're going to, and so subconsciously you pull yourself back down to where you're comfortable. So it's about not wanting to feel uncomfortable emotionally, right?
Yeah.
And
No.
then some people just need to be smarter. They make mistakes out of ignorance. And again, that's kind of like the first one I said. You can excuse that at first, but then they say, "Well, I just don't know how to do it," and that's all they leave it as. I just don't know how to do it. Instead of, "Okay, I don't know how to do it. However, I'm going to study up on it." That's a great response versus I just don't know how to do it, and then that's their excuse.
Well, and that's so two things. Like first, I'm glad when you said you're just going to name a couple mistakes. You didn't just like point at the things that I've done wrong in the
Oh,
past. Like
is that
like
where you
just
thought I was
yeah,
going?
here's a couple of mistakes. So Mark,
Yeah, right.
so I'm glad we didn't do that.
Yeah,
But
good. You're welcome.
I think what you said makes a lot of sense because the answer like, well, I just don't know how to do it.
Right.
Like I just don't know the first step to take. I just don't know the thing. um those are the mistakes, right? Like you're supposed to make mistakes.
Yep.
So the quick story, my daughter wanted a new door in her bedroom,
Okay. All right.
right? So I said, well, how hard can that be?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I went to the hardware store and I bought one of those pre-hung,
Yeah.
door frames. And I took everything apart and it worked great. Like the opening was clean, clear, and ready to go. And I put the door in following every direction I can find on the internet, thinking, well, all I have to do is put it in and attach it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to close it. And of course, like the top kept sticking,
Yes.
right? Like it didn't work, it wouldn't close right. So then I went through 300 different adjustments to try to change it. And it's still like just not closing right.
Yes.
So I made a lot of mistakes in the process. I've never hung a door before, right? And I
Yeah.
know that when I say how hard can it be, people who have done it a couple times are probably just slapping their head and laughing at me. But I made so many mistakes through the process in hindsight, that the ability to make those mistakes, learn and adapt. We now have a door that closes decently, not perfect, but decently.
Mm-hmm.
But if I just stopped at like, well, I don't know how to do this, or I did it and I made that one mistake and it doesn't work,
Mm-hmm.
it just like you can't stop in the process. You have to
Right.
take those mistakes in stride
Right.
and keep going.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That's a good story.
No
I
boats involved.
no, no boats. No boats. I was just thinking of one other uh reason why people make mistakes, and
Hmm.
I think it's common, and that's their ego gets in the way.
Oh yeah.
So they make a mistake for whatever reason that I mentioned, right? That's usually the source of it. But then they don't admit the mistake, or they make excuses for the mistake, or or they even totally deny that it was a
Yeah.
mistake. And when their ego gets involved, it's really a lack of of self-worth and self-esteem. That's why your ego is so big, to compensate for that. So it's a lot of internal things that you need to work on to fix that. But that's another common one that I do hear. They'll say, "No, this is right. I know it's right," and they're adamant about it, even though it's wrong
Yeah.
and it won't work. It's like the door. Your story of the door. Instead of you looking for help, you'd be like, "Well, it should work. There's no reason why it shouldn't work. It's just going to close. Why is it happening?" And you're mad and
The,
just frustrated that it just should work. Just should work. No other fixing or adjustment, just because.
obviously the door is defective.
Right. And right, it's the bad door. You
I
take it
wonder if
back.
that's where like banging your head against the door came from
Oh,
people who
maybe.
had to install them. But like I think a really good point is if you find yourself making mistakes, right, to a just in a certain aspect of life, it means you're usually on the right track,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
If you're making mistakes, it means you're doing new things, right?
Right.
And hopefully if you're of the right mindset, it means you're progressing towards achievement, right?
Right.
Like you said, if you're habitually making the same mistakes over and over again, and you don't think they're mistakes, you just think you're right and everybody else is wrong, and the door is
Right.
crooked, and
Yep. Yep.
that's something else you have to work on, right? That's
Yep.
almost more, that ego and self-sabotage and
Sure.
things like that.
Right.
But if you're making little mistakes along the road to your goals, right? Especially like we
Hmm.
talk about, those goals that hopefully you're writing down every day. But if
Right.
you're making those mistakes and getting tripped up in your fitness, your relationship, your
Hmm.
finances, your business, that's a good sign. That's a sign that you are entering unknown territory and progressing.
Right. Yep. Very good. All right. So let's get into our first step. So I think we laid it out pretty well. I think everybody understands about mistakes, where they come from, and
Yeah.
all of that. So the first one is, and this is important and sometimes difficult to do, is own it fast. Don't fumble it. So don't make it worse, in other words. But the big thing is owning it fast. And so there is acknowledging that you made the mistake. Do it immediately and be completely honest. And yes, it's important to be completely honest with other people, but I think it's equally or more important to be honest with yourself about the mistake, because then you can learn from it.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before. I think it's important to own it and to say, like, look, I made a mistake, but it's also important not to beat yourself up and quit.
Hmm.
Because I think you can see that happen. Acknowledging that
Right.
you made a mistake is the first step. You
Right.
absolutely have to be able to say, whether it's something to yourself or something to, maybe somebody you said something wrong to,
Hmm.
just saying, hey, I apologize, my mistake,
Right.
like that's important. But also, not belaboring it and making it so bad that you almost paralyze yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. And I think that's important for sure, that you need to protect your ego in a certain sense, even
Yeah,
though I mentioned you don't. But it shouldn't, because you made the mistake, it doesn't mean you're not worthy or you're a bad person.
right.
You're just growing. You're getting better. You're trying something new, which is all good. The other part of this is not making excuses or shifting the blame to somebody else. Now, are sometimes mistakes somebody else's fault? Sure. I'm not saying it's always your fault, but if that is your go-to and you're always shifting it, you might want to look in the mirror and say, okay, I got to take responsibility for this.
Yeah,
As a child, and as you grow, and with kids, we both have kids. After a while, there's certain behavior that you shouldn't accept. And if they're blaming you for this, or their friend, or this or that, we don't want them stuck like a 10-year-old when they're 20 or 30.
right.
Mentally, we want them to grow and mature.
I like thinking about this in terms of sales because, I mean, I work with a lot of business people. We work with a lot of business people, and I think about this, from a sales perspective, when somebody first starts selling, a lot of times they'll hit those rejections, which really, like, in the very early stages of sales, for people who aren't salespeople listening, a lot of it is just learning the cadence of how you converse with people.
Yeah.
It's when you start talking to people, knowing what to say, how to say it, and I think people make mistakes in that, and then they get timid and they don't want to make calls anymore because
Yeah.
they feel those rejections,
Right.
right?
Right.
And that's kind of stage one. But then once they get over that and continue to sell, they go into that stage two where they just say, well, these people are just mean, or these people are just like the
Right,
people
right,
I'm talking to are the problem.
right,
It's
right,
not,
right,
but the great salespeople are the ones who say, this is a skill set issue, and I'm learning how to be better at it and how to
right.
better communicate with people. And I think that's
Mhm.
really, owning it and being able to put it on yourself is important.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for that sales 101. You just
Sales 101.
that could be another podcast that in itself. Just three steps you did. The last point on this is use it as to gain clarity in the
Hmm.
mistake. So you understand, okay, what the mistake was, because
Yeah.
sometimes you make a mistake, especially if it's brand new, you don't even know you made the mistake. You're not even aware of it. You don't know what you don't know. So use that for clarity, but also then learn what is the mistake? Why did you make it?
Yeah.
How can I avoid making it again? I think of teaching martial arts, especially sparring, instant feedback, right? When you're sparring, especially once you get into contact sparring, is that's why they're telling me to keep my hands up because you get you get hit in the head, you know. Um, and so by learning that and gaining clarity of what you need to do, you can hopefully learn from that mistake.
Yeah. 100%. So, once we've gotten through that, that part of it and owning the mistake, then it's time to really flip the failure into feedback,
Right.
and really asking that question. I mean, exactly, right? Getting kicked in the head when you're sparring. What did this situation teach me? What am I
Right.
supposed to learn here?
Right, exactly. Yep. And analyzing the mistake objectively, that can be tough, and that's why coaches can help, whether it's with coach in sports, an instructor, or it's a life coach or a business coach. They can really help look at your mistake more objectively, more often than you can because you're emotionally attached to it.
And yeah, and I think that's really why review, is so we talk about reviewing in the end of your day. Yeah, review is so important, but also, I think identifying the cause, like
Yep. Hmm.
was it a lack of planning? You know what I mean? Was it that you just didn't put the planning work into it?
Right.
Is it a lack of skill? Is it a skill you need to develop? Or did you just sometimes we just go too fast?
Yep.
Like
Hmm.
I mean, I see that in a lot of things when you see a student learning martial arts and they have a lot of little mistakes and details. A lot of times it's just because they went too quick. They tried to
Yep.
learn everything all at once, right?
Right.
Where if you pause and just kind of slow down and take that breath, and I think this really applies to everything in life. You can always do better if you slow down and take a breath, and just kind of see where you're at. So I think, really identifying the cause, like why did this happen?
A quick little story. When I was younger, doing tournaments, I would love books at kata, right? One of our katas.
That's
The
one.
students will know that kata, right? It's a great kata. My uncle would go and watch me all the time, and he actually videoed, and I don't have the videotapes. The reel to reel. This was, back in the '80s, and he was saying, you know what? That's not book set. That was quick set because I would do it so fast to get it over with. So he called it quick set. So it reminded me when you said, being quick, doing things too fast. That's not always good. So
Uh,
don't do quick set. Do book set.
Yeah, when students are unsure of a section, I just say, well, just
Yeah.
breathe longer in this one section while you're
Right.
thinking about the next thing. It
Yeah.
works.
Yep.
Um, and then just, I think using the lessons you find to just, really turn the failure into a tool,
Right.
because, that's what failure is. Failure is really just, that stepping stone forward if you can solidify it and build it
Mhm.
that way.
Yep. So now step three. This is very important. This is what you're building up to. So the first
Yeah.
two steps you have to go through in order to get to this third step. And the third step is make a comeback plan. So often people quit in the martial arts. The people that quit at red belt or high red belt, they're literally less than a year away from their black belt. Oh my goodness. It's heartbreaking. All
Yeah.
the years they put in and then they quit really for emotional reasons most often. Very rarely is it an injury that they can't come back from, or very rarely is an injury at all. So make a comeback back plan, and that's moving from learning, which was the first two steps, into taking action. That's what we need to do. So taking action to make sure that we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and then really defining the next step. And if I'm going to use an example for this or a story for this, I like to think about people who want to wake up earlier.
Yeah.
Like people who say, I love waking up early and getting my
Hmm.
workout done first thing in the
Right.
morning. But people who want to do that, they often stumble, right? Over and over until
Right.
they build that habit. So I think one of the things you have to do is if that's a goal you have and you keep, hitting that snooze button and sleeping in, going through step two where you kind of look at why that happens, but then going into step three and really taking an action that's going to change that. So if you
Right.
figure out, I keep hitting the snooze button because I'm sleeping with my alarm clock right next to my face,
Right.
then that, next bold step might be to take the phone or your alarm clock and put it across the other side of the room. So you
Right.
have to stand up and walk over. But,
Right.
I think, using what you learned and really putting an immediate, small,
Mhm.
or huge action into place will,
Right.
that's what this is about.
Yep. The next part of this is committing to that plan. So you have a plan, you thought through committing to it. That means schedule it, put it on your
Yeah.
calendar, put it in your to-do list. Make sure there's reminders. Just about everybody has a smartphone. 95%, whatever the percentage is, has a smartphone, and it has all of those features in there.
Yeah.
Um, the fact that people forget things nowadays with that phone means that they don't have a system to put it in their phone to begin with. They
Right.
forgot to put it in their phone, therefore they forgot to do it. So I can't help you. I can't help you any more than that. You're going to be stuck doing the same mistakes for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It,
Podcast done, right? I mean, you have to do.
podcast over. Put a
Yep,
point
you have
on
to
it.
do something.
And I think really that's the follow through because
Yeah,
there's a loop, right, where it's funny you said that because there's really a loop where you find another mistake, in the fixing of
right,
the mistake. So
right.
and so really, I mean, if there's one thing to think about, it's that follow through, where we continue to build and
Right.
succeed in this process. It's funny when you say this is a looping process, right? Because you
Yeah.
get through one mistake and then you find another mistake and
Yep.
then you find
Yep.
another mistake. And when people hear that, they think, man, it sounds like I'm going to make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
And you think about that, and that should inspire you a little bit, because that's what growth is.
Right.
When a kid learns to walk, they make a ton of mistakes. When a kid learns to drive, hopefully they make less mistakes than
Yeah. Right. Right.
right. But I think it's important to understand that the follow through and the keep going.
Right. Exactly. Yep. Yep. All right. So let's review. So number one part of this is to own it fast and don't fumble it. So we talked about acknowledging the mistake. Make sure you're not making excuses. Understand that taking ownership is important. So that's step one.
Yeah. Number two, flipping the failure into feedback. So transforming that failure into a useful tool for future success.
And the last one is make a comeback plan. So actually make a plan. You already set yourself up for it. So make sure that you're taking your learning that you did in the first two steps and putting it into action.
And that wraps up this episode of the Achieve Results Now podcast. I want you to think of someone who makes a lot of mistakes and
Ooh.
send this to them and
Oh man.
say, hey, you make a ton of mistakes. I think
No,
you
don't
would,
do
no, don't do that. But
that.
send this to somebody who you think would get a lot of benefit from it. And we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening. Hop over to our website at www.achieveresultsnow.com to get your free copy of our book, Ignite Results, for specific daily actions to help you achieve results now. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Achieve Results Now. Thanks for listening, commenting, and subscribing. Now get out there and achieve results now.